So there's been a lot going on with Tezos since the mainnet launch in September,
Yeah.
which followed the beta net that was in June 30th. And so that was very positive. There was no issues there from the beta to the mainnet. And so now there's a lot of exciting stuff happening where we're coming up in the first test of the on-chain governance model sometime in 2019. And that's something that really sets the project apart because most major blockchains don't have anything like that right now. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is going to mean in the next couple of months, and what do you see as some of the first kind of protocol upgrades that might come from that?
Right. So indeed, Tezos has this ability to upgrade its own protocol, and we're not the first blockchain which is going to upgrade its protocol. Like many blockchains have gone through iteration, but typically the way they do it is they have to go through a hard fork. So they have to kind of like change rules, or you can go through a soft fork, but you still basically need massive coordination to make it happen, and you're not always able to have this type of coordination. And the way this is done in Tezos is that you have a procedure, an on-chain procedure, which starts out with something simple like a vote. You vote, and then the protocol seamlessly changes. And I have to insist on the seamless part because it's pretty important. This is not just telling people, hey, this is going to be the new version. Literally, the Tezos nodes are capable of understanding that there's a new protocol, of grabbing the source on the peer-to-peer network, compiling them, and running them on the fly. So it's really, you can think of it as an auto-upgrade functionality, but instead of just being signed by a vendor, like you would have an upgrade from Android or Microsoft, that one is kind of like signed by everyone in a sense with voting. So what that might look like at first, in general, I advise to take things slowly. And what it's going to look like at first is probably something like a very simple protocol change, just to really oil the mechanics and get people used to voting, how to use the voting operations. Until recently, there wasn't an RPC to make it easy to vote. And so now, now that RPC is present in the node, so step by step, we can get to the point where there's going to be a proposal and people can vote on the proposal. And at first, yeah, I can't imagine that the first proposal will be something huge. I think it needs to be something very, very simple, uncontroversial, just to give like one run to the procedure.
And so you say non-controversial, but could you envision where you have perhaps a controversial proposal that, what kind of support does something need to pass in voting? Like a simple majority or something higher than that? I mean, you could still have friction even if you have this kind of procedure on a chain.
Absolutely, and there's always going to be some controversy around proposals. Maybe some people would say like, oh, well, I wish this went in or this didn't go in. But at the end of the day, I think that the time of the proposal is not really the time to debate the proposal. It's like by the time you actually inject a proposal, it should pretty much have been discussed and people know what it is. And then it's a formality of actually doing it on a blockchain. But I don't think it's going to look like, hey, here's a new proposal. You have 8 cycles to decide if you want it or not. The debate happens before. I think that's the way it works.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that makes sense because a lot of this is going to have to have a lot of time spent developing before you could just throw something on the chain, and so there's going to be a lot of work on that, the run up to this. Yeah. So do you know what the schedule is for when the first, let's say, test might happen?
I don't know. I think sooner rather than later. My guess would be a matter of weeks as opposed to months.
Weeks from now. And who starts that process? I mean, how does something like that happen on the chain?
Well, really, anyone can start that process. Anyone. Well, right now, anyone who has one role can inject a proposal and try to get people excited about the proposal and vote on the proposal. So it really could be anyone. I think that probably the first proposals are going to come from some of the development teams which are involved with Tezos. That strikes me as the most likely, but it could be a dark horse.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Well, and those are things I haven't seen. I mean, we've started to see some information coming about this, but those kind of specifics, like how does this whole process work? And I'm sure we're going to learn more about that with more documentation and more people writing about it. So let's talk about smart contracts with Tezos.
Yeah.
Because this is something, of course, that also is why it's kind of called an Ethereum competitor, or maybe an Ethereum killer, some people would call it. It's made those kinds of lists, but differentiating it from Bitcoin, of course, which doesn't have that functionality. So what do you see as use cases for Tezos where maybe Ethereum has failed in some areas to really find that killer app, the use case that's out there that, there's a lot of different, I'd say, use cases for it, but nothing that's really stuck with, okay, we found a better way to do this on the blockchain and it's going to be widely adopted?
Yeah. So basically, I think there's three broad, and I have to separate two things. One is like, what are the use cases for smart contract platforms? Because Ethereum is a smart contract platform, Tezos is a smart contract platform. I think that there are benefits to Tezos compared to Ethereum, and that's one thing. And then, like, what are good use cases? I think is a completely separate question. So first, like, what are good use cases? I put them broadly speaking in three categories. One is censorship resistance. You want to have platforms when you can make censorship resistance payments. This is helpful if you live under an oppressive government, if you're doing political activisms, this type of extreme situations. And for me, that remains the main value prop from cryptocurrencies. That's the main goal. The second one is going to be large-scale coordination between various entities that don't necessarily trust themselves. So in this case, in theory, you could do it without blockchain, but it still makes it a lot easier to have a blockchain. So you could imagine some sort of club or organization of association that wants to organize, and they have members a little bit everywhere in the world. So there's no, they want to have a loose structure as opposed to have a very, very hierarchical structure. And I think building this type of organizations, they've been called DAO, also on blockchain. That's a very useful use case. And the third one is basically commitment not to be a monopoly. So you're a company, you are going to be using a lot of people's data, for example, and you want to attract people to your platform. And one thing you can tell them is say, look, I commit to being an open standard. I'm not going to trap you. And that trapping has happened. It happened with Facebook. It happened with Twitter. You had a lot of companies build on the Facebook API and build on the Twitter API, and then they kind of cut those APIs and you don't have access anymore. So how do you compete with like large entrenched companies? Well, maybe one way to do it is to say, hey, I'm not going to be evil. I commit to have, it's another question whether that can be considered evil, but I commit to have a very, very open standard. And I think these are the three things in order of importance. Now, in the first one, in censorship resistance, I include, this includes more than payments. This includes the ability of having, a financial system. And I think that's why smart contracts are very important. And that's one of the things that's missing from Bitcoin. If you want to have international world money, having the ability of actually making financial contracts like insurance, for example, directly on the blockchain is something that's valuable. In terms of like what differentiates Tezos from Ethereum, I would say that the emphasis on formal language, formal methods is going to be a difference. The emphasis on governance. So why would you build on Tezos as opposed to Ethereum? In a nutshell, because you believe that the governance is going to give some perennity to Tezos. You're building, let's say you build a company, you're going to give like 5-10 years of your life maybe to something, or you want to know that you're going to build on very, very solid footing. The second one is you're building a smart contract. You want to convince yourself that it does exactly what you want to do. And for that, I think most people are going to turn to analysis and in particular formal analysis of smart contracts. And if you want to do formal analysis of Michelson, it's going to be a whole lot easier than if you try to do formal analysis of the EVM, for example. So those would be the reasons. And then the third thing is like, what are Ethereum's use cases? And you have to make the difference between what people say they are and what they are. And just because people are wrong about good use cases for Ethereum doesn't mean Ethereum is necessarily bad. So I think that the whole, we're going to have dApps and you'll use tokens to pay for the dApp and so on and so forth. I don't think that's a good model. And people are saying like, oh, well, it turned out that it's not a good model, so Ethereum sucks. No. It just means that one particular narrative is wrong, but the technology itself is neutral. So you have to be careful not to judge people by the narrative necessarily that they push, but what they're actually building and what actually it lets you do.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you think one reason why I think maybe some industries and Fortune 500 companies, like they're kind of dabbling in this stuff, but we've seen a lot of security bugs and hacks and things of contracts in Ethereum and other places. Like, does this need to be, like you said, the long-term viability of this has to be stable and has to be something that could be invested in now and still be lasting 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah.
So the formal verification at Tezos, does that make a big difference for perhaps creating an environment where you've got very more secure code base for making smart contracts?
Right, and I want to clarify that, you know, formal verification, that's not a feature of Tezos. That's something you do. And, you know, right now, in terms of tooling, there's not a whole lot of tooling for doing formal verification with Tezos. I just think that Tezos is a better footing, you know, a better base level on which to build those tools, because fundamentally, the way things are expressed, you know, the semantic of contract execution in Tezos, the semantic of transaction is a lot more amenable to it. So it may seem like a subtle distinction, but I think that, you know, in the coming years, the development of the tooling around it is going to make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the other big differentiation for Tezos, which is a proof of stake algorithm, which I think, are we calling that liquid proof of stake?
Yeah. So yeah, no, I like the liquid proof of stake. I mostly want to say, like, this is not DPoS. You know, there's delegation, it's proof of stake, but this is not DPoS. It's very, very different. And, you know, I still, just because there's delegation and proof of stake, I still see people saying like, oh, you know, they took DPoS from EOS. I'm like, no, it's a very, very different algorithm. Basically, the idea of look, the idea of delegation is that you have to play a balancing game when you're designing a proof of stake system. So if you give no delegation at all, what I fear will happen is you'll have bonding pools. What I fear will happen if there's no delegation is that people will take their funds and just say, I'm going to find the most trustworthy delegate possible, like person possible, and I'll just like lend all my funds to that person just because I want that extra, you know, percent that can be done by staking. And so, you know, if not having delegation pushes people to say, oh, I can't delegate, man, I guess I'll do it myself. That's fantastic. But it could also push them in the other direction of extreme centralization. Mm-hmm. And that depends on the ratio of like how easy is it to do at home, how versus, you know, how risky is it to trust one person in the system. And so Tezos tries to strike a balance where you basically can you know, keep the custody of your funds so that you don't have to give that up, while still being able to participate in consensus, because you do make a choice. Like, you do have the ability of saying, actually, you know what, I've looked at those pickers, and you can rely on things like pseudonymous reputation. So it's kind of a way to stretch proof of stake a little bit by using pseudonymous reputations. You know, there are various ways, and the Tezos, I think, the fundamental idea of Tezos is that these things can evolve and react to different circumstances. I think right now this is a model that works, but of course it's something to keep an eye on.
So what about where, so the way that proof of stake affects, it kind of gives you an incentive to hold all your coins. And it seems to be, and this is still kind of young, but Tezos, that is, in terms of exchange trading, but it seems that the volume is lower on a lot of exchanges for Tezos. And I wondered if that's because this model kind of incentivizes you to hold on to your coins because you've delegated them, you're baking them, they're earning a return. And so there's just not as much. Do you think that affects trading or behavior?
I don't think that's true that it incentivizes holding. It may be, you know, in some systems when you stake, you have to lock your coins for a period of time in order to participate. And that worked great when you have, you know, when you're in a phase of expansion where everyone wants to hold anyway, and so on and so forth, and it kind of breaks down if you have a period of contraction. So it, you know, but Tezos is not like that. So, you know, there's no real benefits in holding, because there's no time limit. Everything is offset by a few cycles. So, you know, you start delegating, it takes a few cycles, but then, you know, the same is true if you stop delegating. You know, you still get the same few cycles. So I actually don't think this incentive is here, and it's important. You don't want to, basically, if you want to design a good a system that's going to be money, you don't want to muck too much with the circulating supply, because if you have a circulating supply that really gets frozen in periods of expansion and then gets also gets suddenly unfrozen in periods of contraction, you're gonna. I think that actually creates volatility. So Tezos tries to target about 8% frozen of the money supply, and it might seem that you can get it might seem like you can get more security for free by asking for a lot more. So I think like Polkadot asks you to tries to target 80% of the money supply frozen at any time. And that's great in the sense of like if there's a Byzantine fault, you can slash a lot more. Like you can impose much harsher penalties. But on the other hand, I think that creates volatility on your circulating supply, and that's not a good thing. So, and just to be clear, how is there volatility on the circulating supply if you fix the staking supply? And the answer is like, well, in order to fix the staking supply, you have to play with a yield. That's what they do in Polkadot. And if you play with a yield, then you create uncertainty on the emission of tokens. So Tezos targets about 8% of the money supply frozen. And I try to look at Bitcoin, estimate the value of like how much capital is crystallized in Bitcoin. So what is the value of all the ASICs that currently secure the Bitcoin network? Because when it comes down to it, a lot of the mining incentive in Bitcoin is say, well, I don't want to render my, all my ASICs worthless if I'm a miner. And I estimated about 2% of the Bitcoin network, of 2% of the Bitcoin market cap was in ASICs. But that was like a month ago. So right now, probably that number has increased. So it's a few percent, but it's still less than 8%. And that's one interesting parameter to play with in terms of governance.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think about right now? There's a lot of, let's say, the delegation services and banking services that started with the BetaNet. They became popular then. And at this point, most of them are over-delegated in terms of they've got too many coins delegated to them beyond the point where people who delegate after a certain point are not going to be getting the rewards. And trying to communicate that is difficult because you've got a lot of people that are delegating by default in their wallets and that kind of thing, and they just don't know that this service may be over-delegated. Do you see that as being fixed by a protocol update where maybe they could be limited up to a certain amount, or just more education for people to understand that they've got to look at this closer?
I think better UX probably. So, if your wallets and you're letting people delegate, that's something that the UX could check. I don't think you need to do that at the protocol level. You could even have you could develop some sort of standard for bakers to indicate their capacity, and then have the wallets be able to react to this type of things. And you'll need to clutter the protocol with that type of thing. But it's important to do. On the other hand, I will say this: the fact that there's over delegation is a good thing. It pushes towards decentralization, because if somehow you're a big baker and you're like, what, I'm big, but I don't want to grow bigger. That's fantastic. We want this to happen. We want the smaller bakers to collect on that. But the reason it may not be happening is, I guess, maybe a UX problem. So if you have a drop-down box and it just shows you the same three, that's not helpful for the that's not helpful for the network. And so I would encourage anyone who's developing a wallet to give a wider array of options, or even really exercise that presents different delegating services. That would be helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there needs to be, the tools need to be kind of grow a little further in this area, so that when a user who maybe is totally new to it is signing up and want to delegate their tokens they activated from the fundraiser or something, that they have more information. They can understand that like at some point you can't, everybody can't delegate to the same place. And so I think that is why right now it's still great for other smaller delegation services to start up, because there is this opportunity. There's more demand for it than there is availability right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that was one of the, that's one of the interests of, one of the benefits of the token is that you can use them in order to place these safety deposits and actually secure the blockchain.
Do you see, so right now, I know you've talked about this before in the past, that you have to have a minimum of 10,000 coins right now as to be able to, I guess it's just a bake on your own. You said, I think I've read that you've said you see that number coming down, perhaps with code optimizations, being able to handle more roles, changing the amount of the role from 10,000 to something lower. Yeah.
And actually, that would be a good a protocol upgrade. So the main reason basically is database limits. you have to do snapshots of all the roles at every point.
Mhm.
And so, you can't, if you make it smaller, your context is going to grow bigger. You're going to have more IO. I mean, in general, I think one of the things that I'm focused on as a I would say maybe a sore point in Tezos right now is that there's a ton of disk IOs that's happening on every block, and the context storage is inefficient. And so that's something I'm personally working on and interested in optimizing. Once we get a much better, and I think it's possible to get a much better storage for the context, much faster storage, I think it becomes easy to reduce the number of roles. To reduce the size of the roles.
Mhm.
So I don't think the roles will get down to like one Tez, but with some optimization, getting it down by a factor of 10 over the next few years is pretty doable.
Right, and that in itself, probably coupled with better tools, better user tools, is going to help baking proliferate, because if you only need, like, let's say 1,000 coins and you've got the software and everything that makes it really easy, that's going to be, I guess,
absolutely
more widely adopted.
And I think that, for example, so right now, I mean, if you have a Mac, or if you're capable of using the Linux command line, just installing a Docker for
Mhm.
baking is actually like I've had some feedback from people who are not technical, but they were like, look, I read a tutorial, I run the Docker, and I got it, and it's working. So if you're motivated, it's doable. We want to, but ideally you want to get to the point where even if you're not motivated, where even if you say like, what, I just want to use my tokens for baking, and so I'm just going to run this thing. So getting it to that point, I think, would mean having some Windows software. Windows is still a very, very popular way to run it. Having some UI around it, that would be helpful. So if you're out there and you're wondering like, what can I build for the Tezos ecosystem, I think like Windows friendly and UI friendly baking tools. So that's something that's very helpful. There's also the fact that Tezos is still has been live for about 6 months, so it's still fairly fresh, and there still needs to be some reactivity from the bakers. So over the past few weeks, there were a bunch of bugs which were addressed by a bunch of patches, and so bakers they had to be reactive. They had to say like, okay, there's a new version, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Now, in theory, if you wanted to, you could create a very user-friendly version that auto-updates, right? So if there's anything, you just auto-update it. But I don't think that's a good idea, because anything with a centralized auto-update, that's a single point of failure, and you really don't want that. So I think for baking to become really, really user-friendly, you want to get to the point where the baking software just basically like never changes. And I think that takes a few years of running in production and really polishing to make sure that that pretty much can happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it started with experts, and now we have experts and hobbyists, and then from experts, hobbyists to really just like anyone.
Right. Yeah, and I see perhaps even over the next like 12 to 15 months, you see some devices coming out. There's the Coin One miner, which is backed by Coinbase, which is kind of a at-home box that's like looks like an Xbox, where you connect to it with an app, and you can just turn on like, I want to bake Tezos, and so you could turn that on. I think stuff like that is going to push that more widely adopted and used.
Absolutely. It's like, I don't know if you remember the 21 toaster, like 21.co had the idea of like putting mining chips inside toasters. And at the end of the day, I don't think the economics made sense, because with just a little bit of electricity at home, you're not really producing that many blocks. However, with proof of stake, you have a different dynamic. And I think that model of having appliances, something you plug to your router, and it can be a proof of stake system, maybe for not just for Tezos. You can imagine something like a NAS, network attached storage, where you install apps. So you could basically have the equivalent of a NAS, and you can install also like proof of stake validation apps. That I think is an interesting model, and something we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, so right now we're looking at I'm sure that, I don't know how much attention that you pay to the price of Tezos on exchanges. And obviously there's been a dip because the whole market has dipped right now. Bitcoin is tumbled over 50%, and Tezos suffered from that. And I think probably because it just doesn't have as much volume, perhaps because it just came online in the mainnet, so it's not on as many exchanges. Do you think that that affects maybe developer adoption or trying to attract people to the platform when we see the price go down a little bit like this?
I don't know. But I mean, let's see what evidence I have. So when I talk to people, when I talk to developers in general, I don't think that's something they bring up. Like most people I see who want to build on Tezos, they come and they say like, "Oh my God, Tezos is well designed, and that's why I wanna build on it."
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people who will build by default on the default platform, and so if you don't have any strong preference, you're going to look at Tezos, you're going to look at Ethereum, and you're going to say, well, there's multiple in Ethereum, everyone's building on Ethereum, so you're probably going to build on Ethereum, and that's fine. The people who are going to start building on Tezos now, they're people who are like really opinionated about this thing, and that's like how you grow. And so I think it starts with like, I'm not going to say ideology because I think there's something fundamental behind it. There's going to be people who really see the technical benefits of Tezos, who really buy into the governance model, and who likes the design of Mickelson, and you're going to say, look, yeah, that's always how I've been wanting to develop my smart contracts, and that's the first, these are your first adopters. And from there, then you get social proofs, you get social validation, and then other people say like, hey, there's the successful engineers who are building this stuff on Tezos. Well, now I want to build on Tezos. And that's how you progressively grow from there.
And so another thing we were talking about earlier, the protocol upgrades, the voting. One thing that came out recently was the possible addition of shielded transactions, a privacy option using ZK Snark's network. How closely are you following that, and do you think that's important?
Pretty closely, because for me that's fundamental. I mean, one of the things that really got me interested in like really got me really into Tezos was that Bitcoin basically turned its back to ZK Snarks, and it turned its back to proof of stake, and it's turned its back to smart contracts. And there was this three things that I was super excited about. I was excited about smart contracts, I was excited about privacy preserving transaction, and I was excited about proof of stake. And these are the things which are mentioned in the Tezos position paper. I think it's fundamental to have privacy in your transaction on your ledger. You today, in some sense, if you're using Bitcoin, you can have less privacy than if you are using PayPal, because in PayPal, you know the transaction, and PayPal knows the transaction, but it's not broadcast to the entire world. That would be Venmo. But like you wanna have some privacy, and privacy doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that you have to keep it secret. It just means that you choose, who you want to give that information to. Like you can be selective in disclosing your transactions, and I think that should be the norm. Like the norm shouldn't be I'm going to broadcast everything to the public, everything in the open. No, like you want to be private. Mm-hmm. So I'm super excited about it, and this is some people have said like Tezos has developed Snark. Now this is a binding to the sapling library from the Zcash team. So really standing on the shoulder of giants, who are themselves standing on the shoulder of giants, because there's like amazing research and amazing engineering behind all of it. And it's beautiful that, there's sometimes you can see like a lot of acrimony sometimes in the industry, but it reminds me that this entire industry is built on open source software. And at the end of the day, almost all of these projects are open source, and they're all bettering the state of technology and the state of research. I think that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm. What is your thoughts on so in that kind of line, you said privacy is important and it's all built on open source, but what we're seeing right now is a lot of the industry in crypto is being forced to comply with a lot of banking regulations about money laundering and that sort of thing, which is kind of antithetical to, I guess, keeping your privacy and that kind of thing. What are your thoughts on how that's being pushed? I mean, it seems to be a necessity. It seems to be like you can't get around it when you're dealing with this kind of money all over the place. But it's an unfortunate, I guess, byproduct.
Right. So I don't necessarily see any compatibility. And if you look at Zcash, for example, Zcash was actually approved by the New York Department of Financial Services when it was listed with Gemini, and so. They've had, I think, good interaction with regulators who've been able to understand that there are benefits to privacy. Mm-hmm. Also, just because your transactions are private, it doesn't mean that you can be sneaky. So, like, let's say, for example, tomorrow you get a legal order that says, hey, you've made some transactions, you have to show us, what those transactions are. You still have to comply with that legal order. And that's why there are things that like viewing keys in Zcash. So, it doesn't mean it's going to be anonymous forever. No, it means that you have of your own out of your own will, you can actually reveal those transactions. So it's no different than encryption in this sense.
Mm-hmm.
And also, like just in general, if you want to have any type of enterprise adoption, I think there's going to need to be some sort of privacy. If you're, let's say you're a big manufacturer and you have like a small supplier, it can be important that the supplier be kept secret, because otherwise your competitor could try to buy the small supplier, or they could try to outbid you. And so it's just like, as a company, knowing where you're like keeping your payments private is extremely important. And it's not going to happen if you don't have this type of privacy. Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's moving from at least having that option on there, so you can support multiple kinds of transactions like that.
Exactly. And if you receive a payment, that's like, let's say if you receive a shielded payment, it may still be, you may still have to say like, what, I want to know who I'm receiving the payment from. I want some information. You can still comply with all the regulations when doing so. It just means that you're not broadcasting everything to the public.
And so for this kind of change to be implemented on Tezos, this would be part of like an on-chain governance upgrade. Is that right?
Yeah, most likely, yes.
So it's not something where we just decide, you decide. It's not like an individual, the foundation, nobody decides this happens. This is kind of organic, and people would end up voting on this sort of addition.
Yeah, pretty much. That's the idea of governance. So the way it would look like is a proposal for changing the protocol. And if it gets adopted, you could have shielded transaction in a protocol. And now I'll mention one technical thing. So proposal upgrades are just about the files that are inside the protocol, but here we have a new library. So it's technically it would be a little more than a protocol upgrade, because it would also need to be a change in the standard library. Right, so the protocol doesn't re-implement all of the cryptographic primitives. It calls other cryptographic primitives, most of them from a library called Hacklestar. So it doesn't re-implement, for example, elliptic curve signatures or any of that. So you would, in the first phase, you would basically say, okay, you need people to upgrade their nodes, and in order to say we want protocols, future protocols, not only this one, but future protocols, we want them to have access to the functions in the sapling library. And then in the second phase, then you can say, okay, now we want to actually use those bindings. I have a blog post called "There's No Need for Hard Forks," which basically outline scenarios where you want to have hard forks. Like emergency bug fixes is one, and the other one is changes to the standard library for adding new functions.
And we'll link to those sorts of things, because I think that's information that needs to get out there too. More people need to be able to read that and understand how your view of it in designing this whole thing is kind of supposed to work like that.
Yeah, and there's sometimes a misconception, which is that proposals are just like anything. It's like, I don't know, like I propose that we change the logo for Tezos. Like you write something like that, and you propose for a vote for the network, and that's not how it works. Like the way that the proposal system works in Tezos is that a proposal is a piece of code. This is how you change the actual protocol.
So let's talk about from now, like over the next 12 months, what you see happening. Now, there's no roadmap in Tezos, of course, which is something that you see sometimes requested, which I don't think, which can't make sense in a decentralized system. And I've seen that you've sparred back and forth with people on Reddit about that who demand such a thing, but really it's not possible for one entity or one organization to say, this is where we're going to go, because anybody can work on parts of this and eventually submit proposals for upgrades.
I think actually, it's not true that there's no roadmap. It's just that there are many roadmaps. So when people say like, what is the roadmap? The word that I object to is not a roadmap. It's the. It's like, there shouldn't necessarily be one, because many people can have their own views. And so I have a bit of a roadmap. I had a blog post explaining what I saw as probably a roadmap for Tezos. Mostly improving the mempool. That's a big one. Improving storage, better randomness generation, changes to the proof of stake algorithms for having finality on every block, and then some improvement to the governance process. So I forgot the title of that blog post. I think that's the latest that I wrote. So that's my roadmap. That's what I'm interested in working on. different people have different roadmaps, different people have different point of view. Oh, and zero knowledge transactions, but different people have different knowledge. So I don't want my roadmap to be the roadmap. I don't want people to say like, oh, that's Arthur's roadmap, therefore it's the roadmap. No, that's I think that goes against the principles of the network. So I'm proposing a roadmap. I do have some I do have some clouds, like, but I also have some ideas that other people disagree with, and that's completely fine. I don't want to be, I don't want to be in a position where somehow I'm dictating what's happening on the network. And that's why Tezos has governance, is to avoid the need for coordinating around a single individual in order to make changes.
Yeah, and that's part of the whole decentralization model. I mean, you don't have, a company that's, we see there's plenty of chains that have that. If you want to follow that, if you want to watch over the next 12, 18, this is where we're going, quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, that's out there. And they're just kind of different goals and different ways of trying to, I guess.
It's totally fine for a company to have a roadmap, but at the end of the day, what gets implemented in the Tezos network, it basically depends on what gets put in. And that's, that's very central. If you read the Tezos position paper from 2014, like one of the explicit goals is to protect the network against the influence of centralized core development team. That's I think in the first few paragraphs, that's one of the things that's mentioned.
So what do you see right now that's kind of missing in the ecosystem? The community is growing. There's a lot of, the social media is growing, all that kind of stuff. There's new applications I see coming out, like new tools, new websites, is there any area where you see somebody who could step up and do some work in an area?
Absolutely. I mean, anyone who submits PRs or improvements to the protocol and code requests, all of that is always welcome. There's a list of issues on GitLab, and there's some there's some people who have done that. There was this man named Tom Jack who many of us thought it was a supernatural entity, but he's a real person who's just been finding and fixing bugs, and has been pretty amazing. So strangers coming in and finding bugs and fixing things. Of course, that's very helpful. But to answer your question more specifically, in the ecosystem, I think tooling around developing contracts, that would be very, very helpful. So there's a good Emacs mode for Michelson that not many people necessarily know about. There's also a good plugin for IntelliJ for writing Michelson. But in general, having more resources in one place, a lot of good tooling for running contract, running them in a test network, deploying them, testing the contracts, sending them to CR improvers. Because like I said, Michelson is a really good target for CR improver. So there's a project going on right now, which is another formalization of Michelson in Coq. There was one a year ago, so this one is more up to date. So using automated CR improvers to prove properties about contracts. So developing all of this tooling, all of this infrastructure to make it easy and safe to deploy smart contracts on Tezos, I think that would be tremendously helpful. In the same vein, contracts compiling, languages, high-level languages compiling down to Michelson. So one example is Liquidity. There's also Phi from Stephen Andrews. There was Juvix, but I think that's it's not up to date. So something like a Python or a Pascal type of language that would compile down to Michelson, I think would be very helpful. At the end of the day, I do think that most contracts that actually get deployed on the blockchain will end up being handwritten in Michelson. The reason is that you want to squeeze as much efficiency as you want, and most of the time the code is going to be short. But for prototyping, absolutely high-level languages would be very helpful.
This is kind of a theoretical question, but you know how right now we've got a situation where let's just say for smartphones, okay, you've got Apple phones, you've got Android phones, and then you've got development teams that they don't pick one platform, they kind of make an app that works across multiple platforms.
Yeah.
Do you ever envision tools where, let's say I want to develop a smart contract and say I want to support 5 blockchain platforms, so having portable tools, because it's you're going to have competing blockchains over the next several years. So maybe if a company doesn't want to pick one, to interoperability, I should say, to be able to put something on Ethereum, put something on Tezos, and then kind of build on them over time.
Yeah. So one thing we could do is, so one of the advantages of Michelson is that you get some strong guarantees about the semantic of your language, and you can deploy that fairly easily. But with more time, what could be done is a certified compiler from Michelson to WebAssembly. So if you can prove that all of the properties of Michelson you have in WebAssembly, then you could replace the Michelson interpreter inside of Tezos with the WebAssembly interpreter, and then use the certified compiler in order to migrate all the old contracts. So I do think that there's going to be some convergence on WebAssembly. It seems to be what most platforms are adopting, including Ethereum, Polkadot, and a few others. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it would be to try and take some languages like Solidity and compile them down to Michelson. I don't like this approach too much because I don't think people should be writing smart contracts in Solidity. I don't think it's a good language for that.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you one last thing here. We talked about how baking is becoming more popular, and we want to encourage more baking. And so another project I'm involved with is we're starting a delegation service called Tezos Tacos. And what advice would you have for either individuals or larger groups, even enterprise level, in starting a baking service to offer that service to coin holders?
So I actually have a blog post called "It's a Baker's Life for Me," where I give this type of advice. Mostly I would say, if you're going to be even a little big and get some sort of delegation, absolutely use some form of hardware protection for your keys. So it could mean just using a ledger device. Actually, the Ledger app that was built by Obsidian for baking on Tezos, it gives you some high watermark protection and pretty good protection for your keys. So in terms of banks for the box and security, that's actually a really good choice. And you could even have, you could have physical custody of the ledger on a signing machine, and then use a remote signer where you can have, for example, your node running on a cloud, but using signature from a server you have at home. That's a setup that some people have, and I think that's a good idea. I mean, the better idea would be to have everything at home, but if you're going to have your server on the cloud, then at least maybe keep custody of your signer. The other one would be using something like a cloud HSM, for example. So you have that on Amazon, you have that on Google Cloud, and a lot of HSMs don't necessarily support the ED5519 curve, which is a TZ one. But Tezos supports 3 curves, including P256, which is the most standard. So using HSMs is also probably a good idea. I would also say, and that's sysadmins, they have a tendency to really care about liveness. Because if let's say you're a store and you're selling shoes and your store is down for even like half an hour, and all the customers go to that store and they say like, oh, that's terrible. Their website is not even up. And if you're up 99% of the time, you're losing a lot more than 1% of your sales because people may not come back because they think your website doesn't work. Here it's different. If you're up 99% of the time, you're going to get 99% of the block. So the penalty for not being live is not that high. However, the penalty for double baking and double endorsing is very, very high. And so if you have a temptation to say like, I'll have redundant system for my signer, just in case one signer goes down, I'll have the other one, kick up. You just don't do that, because maybe something will go wrong and both signers will start signing, and you'll be double baking or double signing. So by all means, just like have some sort of funnel where you have the narrowest interface with your signer and a high watermark where you can say, I'm never going to sign anything higher than I've signed before. So that's a pretty good protection, and I think one of the main ones to look for. Another one would be DOS protection. It's a good idea to have a fleet, and that's as you start getting bigger, like having a fleet of nodes, public nodes that protects the private node to which your baker connects. And there are tutorials for doing this type of setup. So, just a few pieces of advice. There's another thing that few bakers are doing, and that's very, very different. A lot of bakers are based on the model where you just delegate to them, and then they will find out that you delegated on the blockchain, and then based on that, they will pay out. I think that at the end of the day, we're going to start seeing more bakers ask you to register, like create an account with them, and then on their website say like, I'm delegating, and then only if you actually go through these steps are they actually going to pay out anything. And that's something I would recommend doing.
Mm-hmm. And that might help with over delegation too, because you don't just have random people delegating and you don't know, can't keep track.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to add about what's going on with Tezos right now?
Oh, that's pretty. That's pretty thorough. I guess I can talk to you about like a little few things which are not necessarily glamorous and not necessarily the thing people pay attention to, but I think are very exciting and I think are very important. If you look at the activity on the GitLab, you will see a lot of things, and you can say like, well, what is this thing? But all of these things are things to make Tezos like progressively better, and that's a ratchet, you know. So there's a lot of work being done on the peer-to-peer layer to have a stronger peer-to-peer foundation. A lot of the projects out there, for example, are using Candemia to connect to other peers, but they're using technology which was not designed for adversarial conditions and don't necessarily protect well against Eclipse attacks. So the work on the peer-to-peer layer, I think, is important and useful. The work on the mempool management is also super important. The work on improving storage and garbage collection of the storage. These are things that, you know, they're not as glamorous and as sexy as saying like we're getting ZK snarks, but at the end of the day, what you want is reliability and speed, and this, you know, this gets you there. So, you know, I would say pay attention to the little unglamorous things which are going on in the code because they're actually very important.
All right. Well, Arthur, thank you so much
Thanks for having me.
spending your time with me today, and I appreciate it.